So our next talk, due to circumstances, is a remote one, and it is going to be Grant Jurgensen, who is a recent graduate of University of Kansas and currently employed, I believe, by Kestrel. And he's going to be talking about a verified architecture for trustworthy remote attestation. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's see if my slides work here. All right, there we go. First off, thank you everyone for having me here. As was mentioned, my name is Grant Jurgensen. I'm a computer scientist at Kestrel Institute, and I am talking today about our formal architecture for trustworthy remote attestation. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Adam Petz and Dr. Perry Alexander, who also contributed greatly to this work. And also I should mention for nearly all of this project, I was affiliated with the University of Kansas. Whoops, there we go. Here's a brief outline of what I'm going to speak about today. So I'm going to start by introducing some concepts related to attestation and just getting through some terminology. I'm going to talk about a domain-specific language that we adopt for specifying and executing attestation protocols before getting to the actual attestation architecture that I'm presenting here today, and of course how SEL4 fits into the equation. And then very briefly at the end, I'm going to speak about some formal verification work that we have done with respect to this attestation architecture. So like I said, starting with some definitions, we take attestation to mean the process in which one party provides evidence of its state or identity to another party in order to establish trust. Then the dual sort of process to that is appraisal. So that's when this attestation evidence is received and then inspected and analyzed in order to produce some trust judgment. So again, in this simple scenario, there's just an attester and an appraiser. The appraiser typically initiates this interaction by requesting an attestation. The attester provides some evidence, and then the appraiser makes some sort of judgment. Either, yes, I trust it, or no, I do not trust the attester. So I also wanted to distinguish between two kinds of attestation. So we have local and remote attestation. Local attestation corresponds to when both the attester and appraiser are co-located within the same system. And then remote attestation is when they exist on disjoint systems. And so we focus on this latter case in this work, remote attestation, which is often a more difficult problem, just in that the appraiser is working with sort of less information. It can't take anything for granted about the attester. I also wanted to briefly mention how sort of formal verification plays a role here. So both attestation and verification are ways of establishing trust in software or a system of software. Verification can produce, very strong results up to sort of the strength of the specification, as well as the soundness of the underlying logic, etc. But it's also notoriously time-consuming and so it's often reserved for very critical components. The most time-consuming aspect is that it's not easily ported to a new system of software. You verify one piece of software, now you're interested in another, and you're sort of starting from scratch to verify this whole new piece of software. Attestation, on the other hand, its strength is that it's much more easily applied to new software. Attestation relies on some collection of measurement primitives. And so you can sort of easily just apply those measurement procedures to some new piece of software, and all you have to adjust is your expectation for what sort of measurement results are considered indicative of a healthy system. So we use both attestation and verification in this work. Attestation is the focus, but along the way, we make it a point to try to formally model and verify as many bits and pieces of the attestation infrastructure that we can. So the overall goals of this work are twofold. So first is the actual design as well as prototyping of some system architecture to enable trustworthy remote attestation. And I'll get to shortly why this is a system issue specifically. And then second, as I mentioned, we are interested in formally modeling, verifying as many aspects as we can of this attestation architecture. So now I'd like to take a step back and describe to you Copeland, which is a domain-specific language which we adopt for specifying and executing attestation protocols. So I don't have time here to give a complete, thorough overview of Copeland. I have a link at the bottom for those that are interested in previous work and in Copeland's formalized semantics. But I have a quite abridged version of the language here, of its grammar, just so that we can look at a couple of examples of Copeland protocols to understand the sort of attestations that Copeland supports, and the interesting sort of multi-party attestations which you can express, and that therefore our attestation architecture will also support. So you can see here in the grammar, the A form represents our atomic protocols. So the first form is how we reference some sort of external measurement procedure, external to Copeland. So it's just an identifier someplace and then another identifier. So the first identifier is just the name of the measurement procedure. Then we have the place that we're measuring. And then finally, the target of the measurement within that place. And again, we'll see examples of Copeland phrases in a second. The other atomic protocol we have here is the little exclamation point, which represents a cryptographic signature. So that just means sign all of the evidence accumulated so far with the private key associated with the current attesting component in order to, strongly identify the resulting attestation evidence with the actual attesting component. Then we have these T forms in the grammar representing our top level terms within this protocol language. So in addition to the atomics, we have this at term, at P brackets T. So this is how we actually specify remote attestations. Without this at term, a protocol is interpreted as being executed within the sort of current or local attesting environment. But what this at term means is actually we want this sub-protocol T to be executed in this remote place P. And then the last two forms here, we have this arrow operator and a tilde operator. The arrow represents just sequential composition of protocols, and the tilde is parallel composition. So the sequential composition is, just execute the left protocol, then the right. So as promised, here are a handful of Copeland examples just to give a quick idea of the sort of attestations we can specify. And so this first example shows a simple remote attestation. So we see here it says at place 1. So we're having place P1 execute the following. And it's a external measurement procedure, this hash file measurer. Within P1, it's so within the same environment that's conducting this attestation, and then the name of the file that we're hashing. And then we finish with a signature. So hopefully a pretty straightforward attestation. The next example we have here shows an example of cross-domain attestation. So you can see it's nearly the same, except for at the very outside, we have at P2. So some other place is doing this protocol which measures in place 1. So that's why we call it cross-domain, is because we have this place P2 sort of reaching into place 1 and making that measurement. And then this last example is we just label it here mixed attestation, and it's included here just to show the sort of arbitrary complexity of like nesting these remote attestations. So here we have place 1 doing all of the following. Well, first it will immediately send a protocol to place 2. So P2 is going to attest over into place 1, this hash file measurer, sign the results, and only then place 1 is going to do this hash file measurement procedure, sign the results. So again, the details here aren't important. I just wanted to impart the sort of interesting complexity and nuance of having all of these different places coordinating attestation, and to sort of introduce this concept of layered attestation, where you have many different places across different layers of a machine, all doing their own attestations. So moving on from Copeland to our actual attestation architecture. So we have two primary design goals here. First, we want to be able to guarantee the confidentiality of private keys associated with these attestation components. And we also want to be able to guarantee the integrity of those measurements. So hopefully it's clear why these two properties are imperative for trustworthy remote attestation. I think you can imagine, if the private keys weren't secure, then any evidence you received, well, the appraiser is going to see those signatures and think those are sort of meaningless, because if the keys might have been leaked, then they no longer do their job of identifying the evidence with the component we have in mind. So the whole thing could just be a forgery if we don't trust the confidentiality of the keys. And similarly with the measurements, if the attestation components cannot protect their measurements from some adversary within the system, the adversary could just tamper with measurements or manage to hide from them. And in either case, once again, the appraiser is going to look at that evidence, and if it doesn't already trust the integrity of those measurements, it's going to find them largely meaningless. So that's why those properties are important as to why they are needed to be protected by the sort of system level. Well, we can imagine different choices of operating systems has a very large impact on this goal. Something like a general purpose operating system like Linux, we wouldn't be very confident in these properties. It is perfectly conceivable that an adversary, gets a foot in the system and starts to sort of wreak havoc with this attestation componentry. So a much better foundation for an attestation architecture would be some sort of separation kernel, which could rigidly and statically separate this critical attestation infrastructure from the rest of the system, which is perhaps much more vulnerable to attack. But that brings us to our second design goal here, which is to accommodate a variety of existing systems. Recall that one of the benefits of attestation is that it should be sort of easily reapplied to new systems. And to that goal, a separation kernel would not quite be ideal in that the majority of existing systems, those aren't written for sort of niche separation kernels. They're written for those general purpose operating systems like Linux, etc. So the primary design goal here is just to accomplish both of these goals without sacrifice, which is a bit of a challenge, but that's what we claim that this design of an attestation architecture portrayed here accomplishes. So this figure here portrays our actual attestation architecture. On the right actually is just a hypothetical appraiser. That's not part of the system. It's only there to show how this appraiser will interact with our system. On the left is our actual attestation architecture. So when I started talking about separation, you might have imagined that that's where SCL4 fits into the picture, and you can see it at the bottom there. But I'd like to actually start talking about this architecture sort of from the inside and then work my way out. So you can see in the center of the system is a Linux environment labeled here Linux VM. And this Linux environment houses two components. The first labeled target at the top. This represents the pre-existing software which we want to augment with our trustworthy remote attestation. And very significantly, by virtue of this being within Linux, this should accomplish our second goal of supporting a wide array of existing systems. It shouldn't be too difficult to drop an existing Linux compatible system into this target box here. The other component housed within the Linux environment is what we label here the user AM. This is short for user attestation manager. So AM attestation manager, this is just what we call our attestation components running Copeland. And so you can see here the user AM sort of sits in the very center of everything, sort of connecting all the other components. But its chief obligation is to measure the target portrayed by that red dotted line. So using the typical Linux interfaces, it will measure the target, or also any sort of auxiliary aspects of the environment which are considered relevant to establishing trust in the healthy operation of the target. And so you can see that the appraiser can talk directly to the user AM, indicated by the blue and green lines.
Excuse me, 5-minute warning.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll speed it up a bit. So the appraiser can request what we call a shallow attestation. And so when the user AM gets that request, it will only do this measurement over the target. And so, like I said, we call that a shallow attestation because this system also supports deeper notions of attestation. And that's why we have this secondary layer of this system. That's why we don't have just Linux as the whole system. We have SEL4, which is hosting this Linux virtual machine. And in addition to the Linux virtual machine, at the SEO4 CAN keys level, we have this second attestation component, which we call the platform AM. And so this, at the behest of the user AM, will initiate what we call a deep attestation, which is signified by that red dotted line down below connecting the platform AM to the Linux virtual machine. And so this is responsible for more deep and thorough attestations that the user AM is not capable of performing. So the platform AM, it has sort of one-way read access to the Linux environment, and so it can sort of attest to the overall health of the Linux environment. Things like no rootkits have been installed, no suspicious activity in the kernel space, any of these things that the user AM might not be able to detect by virtue of being within the Linux environment. So I wanted to highlight a couple of interesting implementation details. So first off, we use a number of verified components. We use the KML language to implement these attestation managers, KML having a formally verified compiler. We use a library for cryptographic primitives called Hecl-star, H-E-C-L-star. I'm not sure how it's actually pronounced. Of course, we use SEL4. And then we also have a formal specification of the Copeland language within the Coq prover. And then a couple brief notes about communication and privileges. Of course, the big takeaway that we get from having SEL4 here is that the platform AM, we can have very high assurance that it is very strongly isolated and therefore deemed less susceptible to these malicious attackers. The only communication channels there are the ones we've defined. And of course, we also have static privileges on those, except, well, once the cross VM communication channel is mapped into Linux, then it gets a little hairy because you have to rely on Linux's privilege mechanisms. But that's not the end of the world. The platform AM will just need to keep an eye on that to make sure no unauthorized users have gained access to that communication channel. And then very briefly, we want to discuss our paradigm of key release. Recall that each attestation component has its own private key it uses in these attestation protocols, but we actually avoid starting these attestation components with their private keys. if we can avoid it, because if the component or its environment is already compromised, we don't want to start the component with its key, thereby immediately leaking the key. And so what we do is we have the lowest level layer, here the platform AM. Well, that has to start with its key, but then the user AM will not. We will first measure the user AM and the Linux environment, and then only then release its key and allow it to begin operation. So last but not least, very briefly, I wanted to discuss our formal verification. I knew I wouldn't have time to do this in any depth, so I have a couple of links down below for those that are interested in seeing the artifacts and the details. But very generally, we model this attestation architecture design at a sort of abstract component level. We have a state transition system, which sort of models the intercomponent interaction as the system runs and progresses, as well as tracks the private credentials and the privileges of those as the system evolves. And finally, we embed CTL into the cock prover in order to prove various temporal properties over this model of the system. And with that, I think I'm about out of time. To conclude, there are a couple of really interesting areas of future work that we're really interested in pursuing. One, we'd really like to see more robust measurements integrated into the platform AM within our prototype. At the moment, there is nothing truly robust there to provide as many strong measurements as we'd like. And that's partly just because we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. It's a pretty big engineering challenge to take basically this just blob of Linux memory and sort of reconstruct the structure there in order to conduct sensible measurements. So we'd like to integrate sort of an existing measurement tool there. We'd also like to experiment more with hardware roots of trust, say hardware with a TPM, for example. That way our platform AM does not have to sort of be our de facto root of trust. We might be able to push that even lower down into the hardware. And then finally, I know I didn't get much chance to talk about our formal verification, but embedding CTL into the cock prover was very interesting. It being a interactive and tactic-based prover. And certainly there's some interesting work to be done there to bring the proof automation a little more in line with sort of the state of the art that you'd find in model checkers and whatnot. But with that, I guess I'll end there and open to any questions.
Thank you, Grant. All right, we have 2 minutes for questions, so who's up? Hi.
You got me with his CTL reference there. What stops you from just using a model checker and prove what you need to prove? What are you proving about, I think? Is it because your model is different to what you normally put into your model checker?
So certainly, I think it would have been a very viable approach just to use a model checker. So there were a couple of motivations here. Essentially, we have many artifacts already within the cock theorem prover. I mentioned the Copeland language itself has been specified within cock, and so. Part of the motivation was that maybe one day these formalisms might actually end up sort of fully end-to-end connected within the cock prover if they're all already in that same environment. They haven't actually been formally connected in that way, but that was one of the possible motivations we had in mind. And then we were also just interested in the idea of using CTL in this environment that might be able to employ the typical, decision procedures to resolve CTL when working over these sort of decidable or heuristically decidable problems. But if we're working in sort of infinite state spaces and undecidable propositions, then we can sort of fall back to the full Coq theorem prover to prove these propositions in a typical tactic-based way, if that makes sense.
No, it doesn't. Okay. The only issue here is, well, CTL is robustly decidable. That's why I'm asking, what are the artifacts that you try to associate with CTL properties that this becomes undecidable or hard to decide?
Also, if this is very complicated, you might want to take this offline as we are a bit out of time.
Yeah. So feel free to email me with any follow-up. So I do think that in this case, a model checker definitely would have worked in this case. It was really, I suppose, a matter of circumstance that we decided to embed CTL within Coq to prove these properties, which were not so complex that we needed the full power of a model checker, I suppose.
All right, let's thank Grant again.
Well, thank you.